What's up, everyone? Welcome to another week of Sunday School Classes in Session. Now, I know I missed last week, and I wish I had a good excuse for you, but I don't. Sometimes it's just good to take rest. It's good to recharge. It's good to reset, to get a clear perspective. And that's exactly what I did. But I'm going to make it up to you because we are starting a new series on the book of Judges. Now listen, Judges is a book of war. It details military efforts and conflicts between Israel and other nations. The book of Judges got its name because at the time judges ruled the land. They led military conquests and they settled civil disputes. The judges ruled before kings, so at this time Israel never saw a king, and they ruled about 200 years before Israel saw its first king, Saul. Now, why are we studying the book of Judges? A book of war. Shouldn't we be talking about peace and love? Isn't God a God of peace and love? Yeah, he is, but he's also our champion. He's our conqueror, and he's our deliverer. And the only way to know him in that aspect is to go through seasons and times of war. Spiritually speaking, of course. Did you know that God uses wartime to grow his people? He teaches discipline, he imparts courage, he builds faith. This is how we start the book of Judges. We see war breaking out. Even before the book of Judges, Joshua acted as a judge. He led Israel in their military pursuits. However, at the beginning of Judges, Joshua died, and now a new generation is being raised up. Now, the Joshua generation, they knew God and they obeyed God. Specifically his instructions when he told them to drive out the inhabitants of the Canaan land, the promised land. However, when Joshua died, the people asked for a new leader and God raised Judah up. Now the Bible says that the Lord was with Judah. Judah was successful driving out the inhabitants of the land. However, it got to a point where he started to become unsuccessful. When he reached the people in the valley, it said that he could not drive them out because they had chariots of iron. After that, everything else went downhill. It said the Benjamites could not drive out the Jebusites, so they just ended up living together. On another occasion, some Israelites made a deal with the Hittite in order to conquer the land. They told him, if you show us the entrance of the city, we'll spare your family. And he did. They went in, they conquered the land, but they had to keep that deal, they had to keep that bargain, so they let the Hittites stay, and he eventually multiplied. So now you have a Hittite dwelling in the land with Israelites, and that's not what God wanted. He said, drive them out. Don't let them stay. And now the chapter goes on to essentially say that the Israelites failed in their attempts to driving out the inhabitants of the land. And so they said, you know what, if we can't beat them, we'll join them. And everybody ended up living together. That's not what God wanted. Now listen, on many occasions, God told the Israelites to drive out the inhabitants of the land, the people that already dwelt there. He told them to drive them out. Why? Because he knew that cultural practices would essentially be a stumbling block. He knew that these other nations worship other gods, and that would eventually influence his people. But instead of the Israelites driving out the Canaanites, they made them tributaries, or in other words, they forced them to do labor. You could also say this is slavery. God was not pleased, and he sent an angel to rebuke them. This angel came and gave them a message. Here's what it said. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and led you to the land which I swore to give your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. You shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. What is it that you have done? So I also said, I will not drive your enemies out before you, but they will be like thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken the words to all the Israelites, the people raised their voices and wept. But if you go down a little further, it says that the Israelites still ended up worshiping these other gods. But of course, we knew that it would happen. Listen, it said they started to worship Baalim and Ashtaroth. Baalim is the name for many gods. It was also known as a fertility god, god of rain, dew, and earth. This god was worshipped with sensuality or sexual immortality. Ashtaroth was the plural version of Astarte, the goddess of war and sexual love. So you can only imagine what these people were doing to sacrifice unto these gods. So it stirs up the anger of God, and he essentially sold them into slavery. Yes, God sold his people into slavery. Let me tell you this. It's important to know God as a loving, caring, merciful Father, but if you don't know him as a God of judgment, correction, and discipline, You are robbing yourself of reality. Mercy is everlasting, but grace has an expiration date. And the thought of sin without consequences is a delusion. Anyways, back to the story. So God sees all that's going on. He sees his people dwelling, intermingling with these other nations. And he's not pleased. Why? Because their race?
No.
Because their skin color?
No. No.
Because their social class?
No.
Because they were more superior human beings? No, and no. Because he knew that his people intermingling with these other people will cause them to fall into the trap of idolatry. Put yourself in their shoes. Say you're an Israelite and maybe your best friend is a Hittite. You grow up, you see your best friend doing their rituals. They're chanting to the sun or dancing for the moon. I don't know. You see them burning incense or sage. And you think it's fine, but you don't realize that it's a deeper meaning behind it. There's a reason why they're doing those things. They are worshiping a demonic principality. Any worship that is not worship unto God is demonic. Let's say you're an Israelite and you married a Canaanite woman and she is devout in her worship to these other gods. But you grew up knowing the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you know what his first commandment says. Don't put any other gods before me. But you just end up doing just a little bit of, what your wife does or your husband does just to keep peace in the family. You see where the trap begins? Listen, that's the same trap King Solomon fell into. He had all these wives who worshiped all these other gods. No matter how much wisdom he had, he could not fight off the temptation of idolatry. Don't you see why God wanted us to keep it separate? There's no compromise. All in all, he knew that the intermingling will compromise the purity of Israel's worship. So here's my first point. Sin has no gray area. Now, we could have an entire sermon on this point alone. When Jesus died for us, he introduced grace to us. However, grace should not be taken for granted and is only given for a period of time. We know that we are saved by grace, but Paul also said, should we continue in sin and practice it as a habit? So if God said don't do it, don't do it. More than likely, we won't understand at the moment, and we may never will. And although we might ask him why, it's not guaranteed that he'll give us an answer. Will you still obey him? Some things just has to be walked out and experienced. There are many things God has told me to do without giving me an explanation. And many times I didn't even get one at all, or I wouldn't receive an explanation until after I obeyed his instructions. Essentially, it was a test. Listen, back to the story. Now God sees this and he says, I can use this. Since my people continue to fail and fall into idolatry, I won't continue to fight on their behalf, but I'll teach them to fight for themselves. I won't treat them as the last generation. The last generation, I did the work for them. I did signs and wonders. I drove out the inhabitants of the land for them. But this generation, they don't know me. They don't know my ways. They don't know my works. The last generation did. This one doesn't. So I got to teach them who I am through war. I will let them go into battle. I'll let them fail. I'll let them learn. But ultimately, they'll come out victorious because these are my people. And no matter how unfaithful they are to me, I'll remain faithful to them for my name's sake. Let's look at chapter 3 real quick. Now these are the nations which the Lord left in order to test Israel by them. That is, all the people of Israel who had not previously experienced any of the wars in Canaan, in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, at least those who had not experienced it previously. They were also allowed to remain for the testing of Israel to determine whether Israel would listen to and obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers or ancestors through Moses. A lot of times we look at God as if he is a magic genie and things are just supposed to fall into our lap. If God operated this way, there would be no point of faith. And we know that our salvation, our relationship with him, is based off of faith. Spiritual warfare makes us stronger, wiser. It teaches us lessons for the next battle. And trust me, there will always be a next battle. The Bible said that these nations were allowed to stay in the land so God could test the faithfulness of Israel. Many times in the Bible, we rebuke the devil. We rebuke the war. But what if the war was God ordained? What if God appointed that war so he could teach you some things? What if he appointed that war so you could learn who he is? What if he appointed that war because he needed to mature you spiritually? What if the devil had nothing to do with the spiritual warfare you're in right now? The Bible says that he allowed those nations to remain and he didn't drive them out at once. It didn't say he didn't do it at all. he just didn't do it immediately. Keep in mind that whatever spiritual warfare you're going through, it won't always last. The Bible says that there is a time and a season for everything under the sun. The current war in your life has a beginning and it has an end. But in that meantime, you got to learn how to stay faithful to God and his ways, or you'll get stuck in this cycle. That goes to my next point. Obedience breaks sin cycles. All throughout this book, we notice a theme: sin cycles. Here's the cycle. 1, the people did evil in the sight of the Lord. 2, they were sold into slavery or bondage. 3, the people cried out to God. And 4, God raised up a deliverer or somebody, a leader, to deliver his people. And the cycle goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. How did this cycle repeat itself? Because the Israelites always went back to number 1. They always did evil in the sight of God. If we could be honest, we blame a lot of our misfortune on God, when in reality, God has spoken once and he's never changed up. What do I mean by that? God's commandments, his ways, his standards, they never change. But we always try to compromise, try to change, try to amend the standard of God. But when we find ourselves in trouble, we always say, "Oh Lord, why have you forsaken me?" We instantly look at number 2 instead of looking at number 1. When we do evil in the sight of God, we have broken our promise to him to serve him and him alone. So God honestly doesn't have to honor his end of the bargain because we didn't honor ours. We have to realize that a lot of the cycles we find ourselves in has to do a lot with our continued disobedience. And I say continued because yes, God is merciful and he does give grace and he is very patient. But when we deliberately, intentionally, repeatedly disobey him like the Israelites did, he has to discipline us. He wouldn't be a good father if he didn't. The Bible says that God disciplines those who he loves and he punishes those who he accepts as a child. God's correction is an expression of his love. God sold his own people into slavery. That seems harsh, right? But he had a purpose behind it. And listen to this, as soon as they obeyed, he delivered them. So you mean to tell me the way to get out of my bondage, my oppression, my circumstances, the spiritual warfare, the cycle that I'm in, all I have to do is obey? Yes. Obedience breaks the curse of sin. Obedience breaks sin cycles. And obedience breaks the stronghold of generational curses. So I'll close on this. There is a purpose in your war. And it very well may be set up by God. Maybe he's teaching you his ways. Maybe he wants you to learn who he is. Maybe he wants to mature you. But listen, don't stay in that war longer than you should. Don't get stuck in a sin cycle. Obey his word and receive your freedom. I love you. God bless.